talking a lot about voter registration systems, voter registration processes, voter registration products. But I mean, voter registration is about people. And we can't forget that. It's about people, not about the process, not about systems, not just about the products. Voter registration is a service. It's a service to people. When I was asked to do this on stakeholders, I sort of cringed, because if there's one word I hate in management speak, it's stakeholder. Because it impersonalises the people that you're talking about. It depersonalises them to a certain degree. But for want of a better word, we're now going to talk about stakeholders. If anyone out here's got a better word that I can use, please. Come on, I mean, you don't have to follow Americans and everything. Surely there's an African word for this, somewhere. Person with interest, yeah. Well, yep. Which becomes the definition. So, stakeholders. In management speak, individuals or groups who have an interest in voter registration. I mean, voter registration doesn't exist in some sort of vacuum of electoral administration. People have really intense interests in it. And when you're looking at these people who have these interests, we can divide them into two sets. One which we call primary stakeholders. And these are individuals, organisations who are directly affected by voter registration processes or who can have a direct effect on those processes. Then we can also look at what we call secondary stakeholders. These are people who have an interest in voter registration, but don't necessarily have any direct effect, or in their particular role as a secondary stakeholder aren't directly affected by voter registration. And the classification can be time dependent. People could move from one category to another depending on what stage voter registration is at. If we look at what we could see as primary stakeholders in voter registration, we get almost everyone in the country. So lots and lots of different classes of people. Most importantly, as has been recognised earlier today, people who are eligible to be registered and people who have registered to vote. The most important people for the voter registration. Secondly, the voter registration authority, most likely the electoral management body. Political parties and candidates. Executive government, particularly those parts of executive government that might provide information for voter registration, be it civil registries, be it registries of births, deaths, be it other parts of executive government who provide support services like security, transport. Legislatures who set the framework for voter registration. And one group that often tends to get lost in the mix, who are really important stakeholders and whose support is vital, is the staff that the registration authority employ to conduct voter registration, be they regional and permanent staff who actually have to conduct this in the field, or be they the temporary people that might be staffing voter registration centres. They have a huge interest in the voter registration. Contractors, people who provide equipment and supplies, materials for voter registration. Dispute resolution and supervisory bodies who might have to deal with disputes, and this in some instances might include the judiciary, when the formal judiciary has a role in determining electoral disputes or voter registration disputes. The media has an interest in what's happening with voter registration and also can shape public opinion on it. Observers and monitors in their formal roles of the process. Civil society, both organisations in general and the various interest groups within civil society like youth and women. Donors, assistance agencies, and also sort of suppliers of materials that may be peripheral to voter registration itself but may help the management body in its, or the voter registration authority in general management. Secondary stakeholders, again, potentially a broad range. The whole public, whether they're eligible or not, is a secondary stakeholder. They can be affected by, in some way, secondarily, what happens with voter registration because it will affect the governance of the country. Academia has an interest in terms of research and what's happening. There may be international or regional networks which also have some interest in what's happening in voter registration in the country but aren't directly affected by it. So stakeholders, for want of a better term, in voter registration, very, very broad group of people. So there's a lot of different interests to have to be satisfied and a lot of different competing interests to have to be satisfied. Why are they important? Well, I mean, it's obvious, I suppose. They can provide support to voter registration. They may be its clients. They may be its supervisors. They may be its critics. But all of them can affect the way in which voter registration is perceived. And for that perception is so important for the credibility of voter registration that their interests have to be taken into account, have to be listened to. There's big potential benefits and some risks of developing active engagement between stakeholders and particularly between the Voter Registration Authority and other stakeholders. If stakeholders aren't kept in the loop, they tend to get suspicious. If they are kept in the loop, they can provide support and understanding and provide good publicity, provide good information, provide a positive image of what is happening, and provide support in terms of mobilising voters, in terms of providing additional services for voter registration. Risks, of course, you have risks of potential rogue stakeholders who, no matter how hard you try to keep them on board, will always find that everything is wrong. The EMB is always doing the wrong thing, that their interests are never being adequately catered for. And they are some of the most important stakeholders because it's really important that a strategy is developed of how to deal with them, or they can screw things up terribly. The high risks of not keeping stakeholders interactively informed and their views considered include that it limits opportunities for support, both mutual support between stakeholders and particularly support for the authority. It increases the possibilities for distrust, and once you start getting distrust, you potentially can damage the sustainability of the system, because the sustainability will depend on the credibility, and the credibility depends on the trust. Now, I'm not going to go through why each particular group of stakeholders is important, just give a few examples. Legislature creates the framework, have to keep them on side, you're going to end up with a framework that you may not be able to implement. May well have an accountability role. Many voter registration authorities end up having to report on their activities to the legislature in some form. The parties have a total dependence on voter registration output for being able to have all their eligible supporters able to vote for them, so they maximise their chances of winning power. I mean, parties may also try and limit the opportunities of opponents to register as well. They have a big stake in the system. And very importantly, through their contact with the media and the public, they can have a very strong influence on what the general public thinks about the way voter registration is being implemented. The Voter Registration Authority staff, they're essential to have them on side to be able to make sure that accurate processing or update production of the information happens. And without their active cooperation, without actively engaging the staff, this may not happen. It's a famous example from my country, Australia, where we have a permanent voter, continuous voter register, but like all continuous voter registers, there's a huge influx of new registrations before voting day, because people just couldn't be bothered keeping their registration up to date. For about 3 elections in a row in the 1980s, early 1990s, the registration staff went on strike for more pay in the week before the register was closed, before the election. And this happened because they weren't engaged with by the management. It happened 3 times in a row. At one stage, the police were almost called in to run the register for the election, but thankfully saner voices prevailed with that one. But it's really important to keep staff on side, actively engaged. feeling that they have some ownership of the process, as well as management having ownership of the process. Executive government, as I said before, can provide information that's essential to the integrity of the register, particularly in terms of people who should no longer be on it, or providing confirmation of identity for those who should be on it. So coordination and cooperation with information providers from executive government particularly is important. They may also, in some instances, have a budget role for voter registration. If the EMB is not totally in control of the registration authority, not totally in control of its own budget. Civil society organisations, one, act as pressure groups, so have to be dealt with by voter registration authorities in terms of the civil society trying to advance the interests of its members and make sure that their interests are accounted for in voter registration methodologies, comprehensiveness, inclusiveness. They're also there to inform the public about voter registration and to monitor what happens. Both really important contributions to, or all important contributions to the process. Media similarly informs the public and has a very large role in influencing opinions of the public on how voter registration is being implemented. Voting day officials, often forget them, they have to use the output. If the output's not great, they face a storm on voting day of irate people wandering into the voting station. They have a huge stake, a huge interest in the register being compiled properly. And their views on what's happened, the problems, the issues, the things that have worked are really important for a registration authority to take into account. They're the coal-faced people who have to use what registration is all about. If they have problems, no matter how successful the registration might have seemed to have been, there's a problem with the system. Donors and assistance agencies providing funding and technical assistance need to be engaged. Suppliers need to be engaged because their role doesn't finish when the equipment lands on the front door of the Electoral Commission. If they're not engaged in terms of providing maintenance and support that is actually appropriate for the conditions and for the timing of the voter registration process, then that process is not going to work. So lots of different stakeholders, lots of them are very, very important to make sure that voter registration works well. But you've got limited resources when you're trying to run voter registration. You can't devote 100% of your time to every stakeholder group or every individual stakeholder in each group. You have to have some way of working out how do we pay attention to these people. In the social theory, this concept has developed as stakeholder value, which is also another terrible American management speak term. And it seems it is a really cold, objective way of trying to look at warm interpersonal human relations. But you have limited resources. You have to be able to allocate those resources so they're best going to assist registration. So you need to develop a relationship with all stakeholders, but the intensity of that relationship may have to vary depending on the resources you have. And you can base this intensity on a rational examination of stakeholder value, which is seen to be an index of the stakeholders' power, influence, interest, and potential in voter registration. Small example, a large national party with lots of people, maybe 30–40% of the members of the parliament, compared to a small vanity party, one person's crusade for something, not likely to get many votes. Who is you going to spend more time working with? Obviously you have to spend time and give equal opportunity for information things with both. But when it comes to the crunch, you generally, coldly and objectively need to look at the stakeholder value. And it's unfortunate, but it's a resource reality. Okay, a little bit about